Wonderful. So I'll just hop right in. Please feel free to interrupt or put questions in the chat if things come up as I'm speaking, and then I'll certainly leave some time for questions and answers because I'd love to hear from you. So very briefly, you may have heard recently in the news that the state of California plans to produce and distribute its own insulin, naloxone, and then potentially some other essential medicines. And what I want to start with today is why an initiative like that is so important and what the benefits to society might be. So most of you probably are already way too aware that the US pays the highest prescription drug prices in the world, and that has serious consequences for our society. But I want to start by saying that the problem with the US pharmaceutical industry goes far beyond prices. Distorted incentives in an industry oriented solely around the goal of maximizing profits produces several interrelated adverse trends for our health, our economy, and our democracy. Everything from routine shortages to corruption and regulatory capture, right? The US pharmaceutical industry in its current formation is highly extractive as well. That is, a lot of the money that's put into the sector actually leaves the productive economy, right? That business of developing and producing medicines and getting them to patients. Money leaves that productive economy and goes to the finance and insurance sector, as I'm sure Wendell knows all about, right? This lines the pockets of shareholders and executives at the expense of the rest of us. So very, very briefly, in some, I'd say the public is double taxed for pharmaceuticals in a lot of ways because public funds account for the majority of the basic science that goes into the development of new drugs. And then, of course, we all pay again through out-of-pocket payments, insurance premiums, et cetera. Prescription prices are further inflated because pharmaceutical companies make huge outlays on marketing, on average twice what they spend on R&D. And big pharma companies are highly financialized. They routinely distribute more than 100% of profits to shareholders, and they generate that extra cash by reducing reserves, selling off assets, taking on debt, and laying off employees. So reducing the amount that they spend on the actual business of making drugs and getting those to patients. The industry is also known for rampant tax evasion, right? So lots of money is leaving the industry, and we're all paying for that. Here in the richest country in the history of the world, the effects of this extraction are particularly striking, right? Anywhere from a quarter to 1/3 of Americans report not taking medications as prescribed due to the prohibitive costs. We also have, right, the profit-fueled opioid epidemic, which has decimated innumerable communities, et cetera, et cetera. Much of the innovation that we get out of this industry is actually clinically meaningless, right? What we call Me Too drugs. We get an awful lot of new drugs of the same class that don't have any clinically new benefits, but actually might introduce new harms in terms of side effects. And I say all of this to frame it in a sense by pulling attention to the fact that we believe all of these are the natural outcomes of an industry oriented around the singular goal of maximizing profit. So to get different outcomes, we need a different design. And that's where this idea of a public option comes into play. Because the public sector is not beholden to shareholders, right? Not driven by market imperatives. Public pharmaceutical companies are free from those constraints of profit maximization and rent seeking, and they can then define their bottom line in different ways, right? The bottom line could be about contributions to science, right? Social benefits, a local economic development, right? Getting medications to the people who need them most. Public production can also be a source of good, stable public sector jobs where women and people of color enjoy much higher rates of employment than in the private sector, and where the rates of unionization are better. And that's an upstream investment in community health. The way we see it at the Democracy Collaborative, rather than tinkering around the edges and trying to combat each market failure after it occurs, public production offers a proactive, transformative approach that begins to shift the balance of power towards the public interest in this really important sector of our society, which is the pharmaceutical sector. And if you think about it, publicly produced medications could be distributed at or even below cost because they have positive externalities for society. And this already happens in a lot of places like Brazil, where public labs have been key in producing the supply for the Popular Pharmacies program, which distributes over 100 essential medications to low-income patients for free or at deeply reduced prices. And of course, it's also why things like public education and transportation are often free or highly subsidized at the point of sale, even in the United States, right? We as a society recognize that there are huge benefits for society and for the economy of getting people educated, getting them to work, getting them to restaurants, getting them to the theater, right? Getting them to places where they can participate in society and the economy. And I also want to say this is not a new idea. Medicines and medical devices of all types are produced at small and large scales in the public sector around the world, from the UK to Sweden, Thailand, India, China, Cuba, Argentina, and more. Even here in the United States, the state of Massachusetts has been producing vaccines, monoclonal antibodies, and other biologic medicines in the public sector for over 125 years at Mass Biologics. Public health departments across the country have developed and distributed drugs like antitoxins, vaccines, and immunoglobulins at various points in US history. Until 1998, Michigan produced vaccines and other biologics at the public company Michigan Biologics Laboratory. That included the rabies and anthrax vaccines, which are, of course, critical to public health and national security. Many of these products were distributed for free to Michigan residents, and some were sold at cost to other states. So bringing us up to the present day, what's next? Well, in addition to California, Massachusetts, and Michigan, Washington State passed broad legislation a couple of years ago that was written to allow numerous different approaches, including public-public partnerships with the state of California or others. So they've got legislation that says we as a state can purchase from or enter into contracts with other public entities to procure medicine if that helps keep costs down and get medicine to our state residents. They haven't put too much money behind this initiative in Washington state yet, but the legislation is there that allows their public sector to engage in creative production or procurement initiatives. Bills to authorize public production of generic medicines have also been introduced in New York and Illinois, and they're under discussion in other states. Maine passed a study bill and just released a report about the potential costs and benefits to producing insulin in the public sector. And there's some renewed efforts in Michigan as well. And I think all of this is really interesting and exciting to folks like you who've been working for a long time to overhaul our healthcare system, make sure that we all have access to insurance and therefore access to the services we need. Because public production can bring down medication costs and therefore make single payer initiatives more accessible, right? More sustainable, more economically efficient, and therefore more sustainable over time, right? At the moment, we have out of control costs in the United States, not only because a lot of money is wasted in the insurance bureaucracy, but also because pharmaceutical prices only go up, medical devices prices only go up, because the provision of care is so highly concentrated in the hands of the private sector, right? And anytime we can sort of disrupt that and get more public and nonprofit players out there, we're stabilizing the costs over time and therefore allowing things like Medicare for all or single payer initiatives in states to be more cost effective and therefore, I think, more politically sustainable, right? Because the last thing we want is to win single payer somewhere and then 5-10 years later have everybody in the country say, oh, it's way too expensive, right? This is just a handout to corporations, right? Let's repeal that and go back to something competitive. So I think I like to think about public pharmaceutical initiatives like what's starting to happen in California and other places as really mutually beneficial to efforts to getting everybody insured, everybody covered, and having everybody have access. And hopefully, in the meantime, before we win Medicare for all, which is hopefully very soon, it helps more people who are insured or uninsured have access to essential medicines. So I'll shut up for the moment and see. I saw some comments in the chat, and I'd also welcome questions and discussion. I don't know how many more minutes we've got, but I can also put my email in the chat at the end, and I'm happy to follow up afterwards as well. So I don't know who's facilitating, but let me see. Is there a quality?
Steve Kimball.
Yeah, thank you. I think what you're saying is terrific. I just want to know if you're aware of the PNHP proposal for reforming pharmacy, which is along very much the same lines. It came out in British Medical Journal in 2018.
Yeah, and I've talked to Adam and Joel and others about that. We're very much on the same page about the kinds of things we think are needed. And we've been working since then, in different ways to press for one form of a public option in pharmaceuticals or another. Our organization, we're very small and have very limited resources, and we sort of take an opportunistic approach. So while we think certain things should happen at the federal level, we don't see that happening right now. So we're focusing a lot on states, but we think they're both needed.
So
I'm also,
yeah,
sorry,
go ahead. It looks like you can see the chat questions, Dana.
Yeah. So the first question in the chat was about the difference between a public option in insurance and in pharmaceuticals. So I didn't really cover that, but in pharmaceuticals, what most of us who work on public pharmaceuticals have in mind doesn't have to do directly with insurance coverage, but has to do with the public sector itself at any level of jurisdiction, whether that's the federal government, a state government, or even a municipality, right? A public health department in the municipality of New York City, for instance, can, and in the past has, developed and produced and distributed medications at cost or below cost during public health emergencies. So what we're talking about in a public option here is the public sector getting into the business of doing, right? Not just providing funds for, but developing new medications, manufacturing them, and distributing them without a profit motive. So we do bits and pieces of that now. That the NIH funds a lot of drug development, but we usually don't do the last bit of that in the public sector. We kind of hand it off to industry, allow them to get the intellectual property and charge whatever they want. But we could close that loop at the NIH, and we could empower states to manufacture drugs and distribute them at cost. So again, I think it's mutually beneficial with a public option or a public insurance program, but it is a different thing. Lots of questions. Let me see. Would eliminating patents on medications developed mostly with public money accomplish some of the same goals? Yes and no. So there's lots of great work out there, particularly by Dean Baker and other economists, about getting rid of the patent system. I think there's a lot of political, that would take political will that we don't have in Washington at the moment. But there are a bunch of us who now think you don't have to eliminate patents to get the same results. You could just have the public sector patent a lot more of its own inventions and defensively against the private sector, against private capture, and use that intellectual property in the public interest. There could be big public interest patent pools where all public sector inventions, so whether it's invented by the NIH or the DoD or the state of California or a public health department in Illinois, all of that publicly created intellectual property could be held in common and could be free for use for any public or nonprofit use, and then licensed for a premium to the private sector. So sort of like copyleft for intellectual property, but on drugs. We can go more into detail on that later if you want. And then the other thing that we think is really powerful about public production of medications beyond the IP issue is its jobs. And we need the manufacturing jobs of the future. As we shut down coal plants, which we need to, and other things, right? We need good manufacturing jobs. Those are well-paid middle-class jobs. And we're always going to need medication. We're a big society, and we live long lives. So that's an interesting thing that we think could be, a green jobs of the future sort of thing. So let's see. Are you proposing a PPP program? By PPP, do you mean public-private partnership? That question was from Bruce. You can have public-private partnerships or public-public partnerships. That's a long discussion. What is happening currently in California is a public-private partnership. The state is financing the production of insulin and naloxone, and they did an RFP and they created a contract with a private sector partner. Happens to be a nonprofit this time, but it's run by former pharma executives. It's an interesting thing. I've got some criticisms of it, some big hope. We'll see what happens. They expect their first insulins to be on the market in the next year or so, and we hope that drives down prices and increases access. We're working with the state right now to see if they can go around some of the private sector partners they're having trouble with, like the PBMs. They're concerned about whether every insurance formulary is going to include these publicly produced insulins, or if they're going to say, if the PBMs are going to say, hey, we're not getting a big enough kickback on that, so we're not going to put that on our formulary. So we're talking to them about creative ways to get around that, like direct distribution through community health centers or grocery stores, or using the US Postal Service, so that people can buy directly from the state of California and not have to go through their insurer, particularly if the price is going to be really low. But all of that's in process and in negotiation right now. Can I provide specific citations to laws? Yes, the easiest way for me to do that is to drop a link in to the chat. So here's a link from the Democracy Policy Network. We worked with them and wrote a state level toolkit for public pharmaceuticals, and that references each of the initiatives that I've mentioned. So not all of the bill numbers are in that text, but they're all linked there. So the initiatives in New York, in Illinois, Massachusetts, Michigan, Washington, and California are all referenced in that document. And there are only a couple of updates since then, but you can follow up with me on email. Also putting my email in here. The biggest updates are in Michigan, but things are still being negotiated. With states manufacturing medications, do the meds have to be off patent? Yes. So at the moment, states are only talking about producing generic medicines, right? So medicines that are off patent. And that's because legally, the federal government would have the right to license patents, or people say break patents, but it doesn't really mean that. The government has the right to use private sector patents in the public interest. It's called government use. There are kind of three different legal mechanisms for that: Section 1498 of the US Code, the Bayh-Dole Act, et cetera. But states don't have that right as a sub jurisdiction of the federal government. So at the moment, the easy way in is for states to manufacture generic medicines. You could imagine partnerships in the future by which a federal entity grants a government use license and a state manufacturer manufactures that medicine, or a situation in which at the federal level, the NIH, DoD, other entities are producing new medications and then keeping that intellectual property and saying to states, you can license this, we'll license this to you for free because you're going to produce in the public interest. But yes, at the moment, intellectual property is a big barrier for access to on-patent drugs, which is why we suggest a full public option would also include the development of new drugs in the public interest, so that we can kind of get around that. Am I saying that the pharmaceutical industry is opposed to competition? Yeah, I think the history of mergers and acquisitions in the sector speaks for itself. If they wanted competition, they wouldn't be so hellbent on consolidation. So, I mean, if you just look at the insulin market as a mirror for the whole industry, right? There are three major insulin producers in the world, right? And one of them is based in the United States. Last time, the numbers fluctuate, but they three major producers, so Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk, and Sanofi, have between 85 and 90% of the world's market in terms of volume on insulin. So that's fairly highly consolidated. There was another question I missed here. How do European health systems handle patented medications? Quite similarly to us post-TRIPS. So a WTO rules on intellectual property. The US exported its model and strong-armed the rest of the world to agree. That's a very, very, very simplified version of history. But in recent decades, European approaches to intellectual property on medications are fairly similar to the United States. They're a little better in some ways, like the exclusivity period on certain medications is a little shorter, and that's actually being renegotiated right now. proposed amendments to EU pharmaceutical law are being discussed right now, and our allies there are hoping for a final vote on some small improvements by March of next year, which would be before the next EU Parliament elections. We'll see how that goes. We're tracking it closely. There is also a proposal in the EU right now for huge public investment in public pharmaceutical R&D. There's some fantastic Italian economists and others who've been working for years to propose essentially something that looks like the CERN, where they do small collider, whatever, science that I don't understand in a different sector, in the public sector. They want huge regional infrastructure in Europe to develop new medications and use the intellectual property in the public interest, to the tune of several billion euros. And that's being debated right now as well. They're proposing an amendment to the EU pharmaceutical law in the wake of the pandemic that would say, let's do this in a different way, particularly to ensure that we get things like new antibiotics and vaccines that we all need. They've got huge resistance from big pharma, but we'll see where they land. It's a different political context than here. And can a multi-state publicly owned PBM be useful? I sure think so. And I sure think that's the low-hanging fruit, because everyone hates PBMs, right? Big Pharma has been trying to tell everybody for years that PBMs are the problem. They're one of the problems, but there's nobody else in the world has PBMs. We didn't have PBMs for all of history. We can certainly live without them. There are a lot of Republicans who hate them too. So it seems to me like that would be the first place to go. The state of Utah even discussed it. A Republican state senator in Utah proposed about 3 years ago that the state be its own PBM, at least for a insulin, right, for procuring insulin. In the end, that proposal got shifted a little bit, but I certainly think like a regional compact, you could see it in the Northwest or the Northeast, right, where there's already interesting regional discussions in the healthcare sector. You could see a region saying, we're just going to be our own PBM. Wholesale distribution is really highly consolidated too. We're gonna disrupt. We're gonna break through that, and that would be really helpful to the states that are getting into manufacturing, right? To have a public distributor to work with. Leslie, yes, I've talked a couple of times to the ArrayRx folks, our close allies at T1 International, the group of the independent group of type 1 diabetics who have chapters around the country. They're more in contact with ArrayRx, and I kind of rely on them for the latest. But yes, I think ArrayRx is doing really interesting things and has the potential to grow. It seems like, particularly in Washington State, where legislation already empowers the state to do a lot more, but they just don't have the money to do it yet. There are people working in the public sector who would like to do a lot more in terms of bringing down drug prices and increasing accessibility, and they just need support. So I think we need people who live in Washington State to be calling their reps and showing that the public wants this. And then I see Mike's got his hand up.
Yeah, I don't know. And Lloyd Alterman asked the question, could you comment on direct to consumer pharmaceutical advertising? I didn't hear if that was answered.
Oh, sorry, I missed that one. Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly what your question is there, but it's only legal in a couple of countries, and we certainly, Big Pharma spends a lot of money on it in the United States, and you could say that that's waste that we don't need, and that public and nonprofit producers wouldn't necessarily spend the same amount on advertising, and that again would bring down costs. I think there's probably going to be some advertising from like the state of California, for instance, to make sure that people know that they have a low-cost insulin, to ensure that patients know it's out there so that they will use it. But I'm assuming it's not going to be the same as the snazzy, campaigns that come out of Lilly and Pfizer and that sort of thing. Direct-to-consumer advertising is illegal in most countries of the world, so it's a really interesting aberration of the United States. And then, yeah, so cost plus is really important. So for folks who don't know, Mark Cuban has a nonprofit, a pharmaceutical company that that deals only in generic medicines, and they purchase directly from manufacturers, so they're cutting out the distributors, which again, I think is low-hanging fruit. I think, states could do this too. They didn't. They let a billionaire do it first. I think it's really important to a lot of patients. I get 2 of my medications through Cost Plus because it's a whole lot cheaper than getting them through my insurance. I think it's really important, and also proves a point that there is an extraordinary amount of waste and extraction in our current pharmaceutical supply chain. So yeah, I think they did prove that no PBMs are needed, and I think we should all use that and remind, right, our representatives, remind people when they're talking about policy that it's been done. We've shown that this is not necessary. And again, the big thing that Cost Plus doesn't solve, though, of course, is the brand name market. And while 80% of our medications by volume, right, as a country, 80% of what we consume is generics, the majority of the cost, right, in our pharmaceutical spending comes from brand name drugs. So the real problem, and again, somebody mentioned PNHP and my dear friend Adam Gaffney back then, as Adam always likes to say, public R&D is the sine qua non of a public option in pharmaceuticals, right? That's R&D is the point of greatest extraction in the pharmaceutical supply chain process at the moment. It's where the decisions get made about what drugs we're going to get and what we're not going to get. But because of the way, right, we manage intellectual property in this country, it's the point of the greatest extraction and the point of greatest leverage, right? It's the top of all of it, and everything else trickles down from there. So that's why we're working hard at the federal level on R&D and on intellectual property. But at the same time, we think that states and municipalities really can disrupt and show the country that things are possible, that you don't actually need Pfizer for everything, right? That there are other ways. So we're hoping that that movement at the state level is illustrative in that sense, but also begins to build more of a base of people and people in government that are demanding change.
So Dana, your topic is so interesting that we could go through the rest of the hour, but maybe instead we would ask you back for another session.
Happy to do that. And I think I dropped my email in there. And if I didn't, feel free to send it around. We can do this another time. We can do a workshop. We can invite your representatives on the call, anything you want. This is really important to me, and I feel very lucky to get to speak about these issues. And I feel really lucky when I get to meet people like you who care about these issues, but are also extremely knowledgeable. This is the best set of questions I've ever gotten from a short presentation, and that reflects on how informed you all are. So thank you, and don't hesitate to follow up.
Well, thank you so much, Dana. We really appreciate your energy and information, and we will call on you again.
Okay. Wonderful. Have a great rest of your meeting. We'll talk soon.
Okay, thanks.